Ultraman.
Ultraman.
Yeah.
Oh, Ultraman does
Ultraman,
something.
yeah. Oh.
That's a vibrator. No? No? I thought it was a... really?
奴の尻の穴を狙い。はい。
Considering the name of my channel is Retro Robo Boy, you would think by now I would have reviewed something that kind of matches that title. Well, today we're going to do just that and talk about Ultraman. More specifically, we're talking about Shin Ultraman, which is a remake slash reboot of the classic 1960s series, Ultraman. Ultraman is about as iconic as Godzilla when we're talking about Japanese pop culture. It's responsible for bringing the big budget tokusatsu giant kaiju movie theater experience to the small screen. And there have been dozens of iterations over the past 60 years or so. I mean, there's been a lot, spanning many different tones and styles, but one thing rings true: Ultraman is a certified badass. Ultraman's one of those series that I'm familiar with through cultural osmosis. It's a similar relationship a lot of people have with something like Star Wars, Star Trek, Doctor Who, Pokemon, any other big pop culture franchise. It's one of those things that's so famous that it's kind of hard not to know even just a little bit about it. But especially if you're into Japanese cinema, or if you like anime, Japanese games, etc. Personally, I haven't actually consumed a lot of Ultraman media directly though, but I've seen so many parodies, toys, video games, wacky Japanese commercials, and other references and things that were inspired by it, it feels like I've always known Ultraman. But if you didn't already know, I'm a pretty big Godzilla fan. And in the Godzilla universe, there's a character that is strikingly similar to Ultraman named Jet Jaguar. Fun fact, Jet Jaguar was actually designed by a child who entered in a drawing to a character design competition. And just looking at him, yeah, it's pretty obvious. I mean, just look at the dude. Just look at him. Someone has some explaining to do here. And Godzilla is extra relevant here because it's made by the same production team behind 2016's Shin Godzilla. And it belongs to what I like to refer to as the Shin Metaverse. I don't know if there is an official name for this like tokusatsu, revamp, but so far we have Shin Godzilla, Shin Ultraman, and the upcoming Shin Kamen Rider. I can't lie and say that my main interest and my main motivation to see this movie was the fact that it was directed by the beloved Hideaki Anno. And just to prove how obsessed I am, it's beautiful. I love it. And yes, I even have Best Girl tattooed on my leg. I know you're jealous, you wish you had this. But to prepare for this movie, I thought it'd be nice to do just a little bit more research, and I actually watched the first 4 or 5 so episodes of the original 1960s series. And even though it was a very short amount of time, I actually enjoyed it quite a bit. It had the same kind of charm you would get from watching the original Star Trek. Sure, it's not super polished and modern, but I feel like if you like that old-fashioned kind of Godzilla look, it's more of the same, just a little bit more episodic. Clearly I liked it enough because I saw this shit at Target and was like, well, that's mine now. Like I said, Ultraman's a certified badass. But can we talk about how low-key Ultraman's face is kind of scary? I mean, just look at this, it's pure nightmare fuel.
Hey yo, what the fuck?
So I went into this with very even-tempered expectations, to be honest. I didn't have a really big preconceived idea of what this movie should be. And when I did my research, I found quite a few entries that I think would be good for me. That's what's kind of nice about these big franchises, is that they have so many different tones and styles and so many different iterations. There's bound to be at least one that you like. So unlike Shin Godzilla, this time around, Hideaki Anno was not the director. His co-director and longtime collaborator Shinji Higuchi took the director's chair this time. I didn't realize how familiar I was with his work until I checked his IMDb page. Not only did he work with Anno in his animation endeavors, he also did the effects for another famous kaiju franchise, Gamera. If you don't know Gamera, he's basically just Godzilla, but he's a giant turtle and he's not an absolute dick. He's literally the guardian of the universe. I guess Godzilla can be nice sometimes though. He also did one of my guilty pleasures, and please, for the love of God, don't cancel me for this. I swear to God, I know what I'm talking about. Hear me out. He did the live action Attack on Titans. I know they're awful, but that's why they're so good. While those movies on a critical level are absolute garbage, I won't lie, they're some of the most fascinating modern day kaiju movies ever. Seeing how they visually translated the Titans onto screen and getting to see all the miniature buildings get destroyed by people wearing skin suits and like punch each other and like just do some WWE fucking wrestling shit with just gore everywhere, it's honestly a treat. So if you like giant monsters and that like practical, classic tokusatsu like miniature building destruction type special effects, it's literally like an R-rated version of that. And to me, I'm like, there's really not a lot of that to go around, so you gotta eat it up when you can. Just turn off your brain and enjoy the ride and enjoy all the nasty ass effects. Even though he wasn't in a director's chair this time around, Hideaki Anno did write the script. However, on a far more fascinating note, he actually did the motion capture for the titular character himself. That's right, every motion of Ultraman was done by Hideaki Anno in a crazy mocap suit. This is very significant because he actually made a short fan film in college. It's kind of amazing to see his career come full circle like this. Like, the man was just a big otaku nerd in the 70s and 80s, but then some of his earliest animation work was being an apprentice under Hayao Miyazaki for Nausicaa. Then he got to be the main voice actor in Hayao Miyazaki's final film. In his college years, he'd be cosplaying Kamen Rider in his free time. He also accidentally ended up creating one of the greatest, most world-renowned giant robot monster anime of all time. And after making a reboot of his giant kaiju battle anime series, he ended up making a legit reboot of the classic Godzilla film that inspired that kind of animation, only to be followed by the reboots of Ultraman and Kamen Rider. I mean, the man is a legend and inspiration to us all, and it goes to show being a big fat nerd can actually pay off. Shin Ultraman follows the exploits of the SSSP, which stands for S-Class Species Suppression Protocol Team, a group of scientists who each managed to take down a kaiju invading Japan. In this world, giant monsters have mysteriously and suddenly began regularly attacking Japan. When an invisible giant monster named Naranga appears, our main hero, Shinji Kaminaga, yes, we have yet another Shinji, gets caught up in the battle with a giant alien being soon to be known as Ultraman. He comes down and intervenes in the battle on mankind's behalf. This launches the mystery of who is Ultraman, why is he here, and what conspiracy is going on between humans and aliens. So right off the bat, I was very intrigued by this world because I love kaiju. The film opens with this amazing montage of giant monsters attacking, and it feels a lot like a montage you would see in something like The Incredibles. This film also uses the same flashy screen text title motif as seen in Evangelion as well as Shin Godzilla, so it felt very familiar. And unfortunately, yes, it's just as hard to keep up with. It can be kind of distracting when you have text on the top and the bottom of the screen, and sometimes it's literally on the top, the bottom, and in the middle. But I can definitely say I really appreciate that they just throw you into this world. Another interesting thing about the opening credits is the fact that they actually recreate the opening effects seen in the original 1960s opening. You see the title Shin Godzilla pop up on screen, and then it wipes away and becomes Shin Ultraman. This is actually a reference to the original series when it had the original Q series title pop up, only to be replaced by Ultraman. And as a funny nod and Easter egg, the first monster you see actually is a legit 3D render of Shin Godzilla, but with a bunch of crap put on top of it to make it look like some new monster. This is a very meta Easter egg. This is actually a reference to the original show, which used one of the old school Godzilla costumes recycled with a bunch of extra pieces on top to try and make some new monster for budgetary reasons. And I think it's a very clever and charming parody of that. I also appreciate that the tone is established to be very silly and kind of campy from the start. You get to see the scientists having banter back and forth, and there's a similar kind of bureaucratic, dry feeling that you get from Shin Godzilla. It's definitely a little bit more silly and humorous this time around. However, much like Shin Godzilla, the characters don't really get a lot of characterization and personality. I would say they get a little bit more than before, but not as much as I would have liked considering the runtime. And not to get into complaints too early, but I think a big thing I'm going to mention now and you're going to hear a lot of is just how off or kind of all over the place the pacing was in this movie. It kind of feels like Hideki Anno really wanted to fit in as much as he could, just in case they weren't able to make a sequel. Because after the opening, when Ultraman comes down, the initial premise is that we're trying to find out who Ultraman is and why he's here. But then another character, who's a famous villain from the original show, he appears and suddenly you're introduced to this new conspiracy plot. But then following this plot line, that villain eventually gets resolved probably about halfway through, and then we're immediately introduced to another villainous character with an even bigger conspiracy on top of that. There's a couple battles to break up all the banter, but there are so many exposition dumps and lore being thrown at you, you never really have a chance to breathe. And because this movie takes kind of an episodic format, it feels like it has a 5-act structure, which isn't inherently a bad thing. You can definitely make that work. But sometimes this movie feels somehow simultaneously too long and not long enough. It's going too fast for you to absorb the information, but also feels so disjointed that you can't help but feel like it's not getting to the point. For me personally, there's just one too many villains, and there wasn't really a central conflict. I mean, there was, don't get me wrong, but because of the way which the story's told, it ends up feeling more jumbled than it might actually be. I think both villains are genuinely fascinating. Also, quick side note, one of these villains has like a big kaiju transformation, and to me, he looks almost just like that big metal robot from the first Thor movie. Anyways, so you have this first villain who comes in, figure out what his motives are, he's dealt with. Then you have the second villain coming in with another underlying plot, and it's just going. They're telling you this is what he wants, this is what he wants, this is what and I was like, what? And then you have this other like Ultraman like character come in, and you know, he starts spouting off lore, and I'm not saying I want the movie to hold my hand and baby me, but holy shit, throw me a bone once in a while. I mean, at this point, you already have 4 or 5 different parties when you factor in the SSSP, the Japanese government, Ultraman, the first alien, the second alien, and now this other Ultramang. Did we really need that many double crosses and boss battles in one movie? Also, there's one big question that they answer in the movie, but they do it in a way that left me more confused. Now, maybe I'm just being a dumbass here, but I actually would like to see what people say in the comments. I don't really think this is a spoiler, but just in case, you can skip ahead. So they reveal that the main character Shinji is technically dead, and Ultraman says that he fused with him. So we do get this really awesome fish out of water, almost like Meet Joe Black kind of situation. It's very funny at first, but honestly, I actually don't think they spend enough time on that aspect. I would have liked to see a lot more of that to get more attached to the character. But from what I can remember, it's kind of different from that original series in that in this version, they really emphasize Ultraman psyche as opposed to the original host psyche. So is Shinji a part of Ultraman, or did Ultraman possess his body? Well, I mean, clearly he didn't possess his body because his dead body's on the ground, but at the same time, like, he's not a clone, or is he a hologram, or, you know, like, is any of him left in there? Because is it like a soul spirit thing? He talks about having his will influenced by Shinji, but I'm like, so is this like a Get Out situation? You know what I mean? Like, is Shinji in the sunken place? Like, as Ultraman's walking around, like, reading books and, like, eating tacos and shit, is Shinji just inside of him screaming for help? I'm like having an existential crisis here thinking about this. They just did not make that very clear to me. So please, I need answers. And obviously, a lot of this has to do with the fact that I'm not super intimate with the original source material. Not to mention, there's a language barrier of having extremely fast subtitles and having so much packed into one movie. Like I said, there's a lot of moments where they had information dumps while someone's giving a monologue, and it's tough to read subtitles at the top and the bottom of the screen at the same time. This movie also has a lot of deeper themes about humanity and morality, the meaning of life, and all those other familiar benchmarks you expect to see in this kind of sci-fi epic, let alone an overly poetic Japanese-styled anime plot. None of these things are new to a Hideki Anno story, let alone something like this. And not to pull this card, but at this point, it's hard to feel like these things aren't like super derivative of other things, including probably the Ultraman series itself, as well as things by Hideki Anno, or just, you know, this kind of sci-fi in general. It's very The Day the Earth Stood Still, 2001. And don't get me wrong, I have nothing wrong with the themes themselves. I mean, these are normal, powerful things. I mean, the human condition is always going to be what any story is about at the end of the day. But I think what I'm trying to say here is I found it kind of hard to get invested in this world and this story when it's being so broad and so open and packing in so much and not really letting you feel the characters and really kind of get into the world more naturally in a way that doesn't feel quite as contrived. There's not really a lot of time spent on the characters as people, and this is a problem I see in a lot of stories like this. Even some of my favorites like Akira, Ghost in a Shell, it's not unique to this movie, so I can't really bash on it too hard. A lot of writers always seem to get so swept up by the world and the themes that the actual story or plot progression kind of gets lost in the mix. And going back to a 5-act structure versus a, you know, traditional 3-act structure, or, you know, having like this kind of episodic format, I think this kind of thing works best if you have it as like a series of things happening to get to a point. Like you need a very clear-cut destination, and this movie doesn't really have that. They introduce new ideas so fast, and there's just so much information getting jumbled that you can't help but feel like this is a compilation movie of a TV series. By the time we get to the super crazy, like godlike battle at the end, I'm like, what's happening? I don't plan to get into any super heavy spoilers on this part of the review, but I will say that the climax of this film falls into that generic big thing in the sky that needs to be destroyed or else the world will explode type situation that you always have in these kind of movies. There's a little bit of End of Evangelion meets like Super Sentai in there, but I felt like such little time was actually spent on the human characters that I had a hard time really rooting for the heroes. The main relationship that's kind of focused on in this movie is between Shinji Kaminaga and his new SSSP partner, Hiroko Asami. And at first, it seemed kind of promising. I liked it a lot. You know, she was super kind of spiffy, and she was very energetic and humorous. Definitely had a lot of energy. And the joke obviously is that Shinji, who's Ultraman, has this very like stoic, cold alien, like dead, demeanor, and he, all this shit's flying over his head, and there's like this awkwardness between them, and she's supposed to be his partner and his buddy, and she wants to connect to him, but he keeps pulling away. Yes, this is another Shinji situation as usual. And again, you have this kind of fish out of water dynamic, and it's funny at first, but they really don't spend a lot of time together on screen for the most part. Like, other than a couple scenes, part of the joke is that he's always gone, but it doesn't work because by the end of the movie, you're supposed to feel this like strong connection or, this sense of trust. And I'm like, y'all haven't spent more than like a few minutes of screen time together, and within the context of the story, maybe only a couple days, if not a few hours together. So when they set up this big emotional moment at the end, I just didn't feel anything, and it sucked because I wanted to. I know I sound like I'm being pretty harsh on this, and from the reviews, I can tell that people who were really hyped for this movie and who are really invested in Ultraman, they seem to have had a really good time with it. And I'm happy to see that, because clearly who this movie was made for, it was made right. So this is one of those movies, upon rewatch, maybe after I've delved into some more Ultraman stuff, I can appreciate more. But, the whole point of this movie was to be the next generation for this character, not just fan service. I will say this movie clearly did succeed in making me interested in Ultraman, and I probably would not have been experiencing the rest of the franchise if it weren't for the release of this film. So, I'm not just hating on it, I'm not trying to be a contrarian, but I can't be a honest critic and just be like, oh yeah, it was cool, Ultraman. It's like, no, I gotta call it out. And at the end of this day, if I had to, summarize my main thing about this movie, is that it's messy. But now let's talk about the special effects. The visual effects in this film are more or less what I expected, and that's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's kind of in the middle. Japanese film productions don't have near the amount of money or budget that Hollywood does, so of course it's not a fair comparison. Shin Godzilla has some gorgeous cinematography and some genuinely haunting imagery when it comes to Godzilla. But there's a couple shots in that movie that even the most lenient critics would say kind of look like a PlayStation 4 title. But because this movie has a little bit more humor and has more of a 60s superhero superhero theme, I expect the action to be a little bit more goofy. Majority of the battles and the special effects were genuinely fascinating. I particularly like any of the moments where you got to see the giant monsters interacting with buildings and nature. You know, the classic tokusatsu stuff. Ultraman himself, as well as all the monsters, were completely CG, just like Shin Godzilla. You have a few insert shots and things that are up close that use practical, you know, trees and dirts and like building effects. And those shots are really pretty, and for the most part, I thought the CG worked. And I really can't complain too much here because from what I've seen, all of the movements and choreography and poses are very true to the original series, and that means, yes, they're gonna be silly as shit. But sometimes, I would say, it was even too much for me. There's a scene of Ultraman spinning that is so damn funny, it lives rent-free in my head. It looks exactly like that super shitty live-action Fantastic Four film from the 90s where Johnny Storm is getting blasted and his ass is just spinning in circles like this. It looks exactly like something straight out of Xavier Renegade Angel or a reboot. If you don't know what those two things are, you're too young. Turn this off. Another reason why some of this bugged me is because the ending of this movie tries to make a more serious, dark turn. By comparison, this film is a little bit more gritty, and I'm using that word lightly, but it's a little bit more gritty and dark than the original series. But again, we don't have the most strong characters, and it's hard to get invested in some of the action. If anything, I feel like this movie needed to be just maybe a little bit sillier, maybe just leaning a little bit more into the cheesy aspect, have a stronger satirical element. Maybe it wouldn't bother me as much if that was the case. I will say the design and setup for Zeton, who's an enemy from the original show, what they did with that character in this movie was pretty badass, I'm not gonna lie. Even if the effect itself didn't look very convincing, the sound effects alone was just so cool. And speaking of which, let me talk about the rest of the audio. This is gonna get a little controversial, but for the love of God, please hear me out. I swear I'm not being a hater. The audio in this is very similar to Shin Godzilla, and yes, again, I'm gonna say some shit that's probably controversial, and I apologize. I understand that these two dorks are huge nerds, and they absolutely love the stuff from their childhoods. I respect that, I can relate to that, I totally get why they do this. But I cannot stress this enough, how distracting and inappropriate using old 1960s era mono sound effects can be. Again, if these movies were slightly more humorous or on the nose, it'd be a little bit more forgivable. But when you're watching a modern day movie with modern effects, using modern sound mixing, and then you suddenly drop in a tank explosion, or maybe a muted monster noise that was recorded 60 years ago, it kind of feels like someone's slamming a button on a soundboard. I think another reason why it's so frustrating is because honestly, it's not even the sound effects themselves, it's the audio mixing. The 1954 Godzilla roar is iconic. Yes, there is a way you can use it without it sounding so flat. This is supposed to be absolutely ginormous, this giant creature, towering buildings, but then there's absolutely no bass or reverb, and it just ends up making it sound like someone's putting stock audio in a work in progress cut. And I think it actually matters less for like alien or monster noises than it does for tanks and planes and other weapons. I think it's, we have so many references for what these things sound like because of video games, because of even anime like Evangelion, that when you have these older sound effects dropped in, it's cute the first time, but the novelty wears off fast. If your goal is to make your threats seem serious and intimidating, and you're presenting it in a very clean, modern, new rendition, it seems just a little counterintuitive to mix in audio like that. I mean, maybe this is like a bad analogy, but imagine if you were watching a biopic about like the Hiroshima and Nagasaki buildings, right? It's a super serious drama, really great editing, special effects, and then when the bomb drops, they play this sound effect. You would be like, what? Or if you're watching a movie about, I don't know, like the JFK assassination and the same thing, and they lines up that shot and then you hear, it would be unintentionally hilarious. All right, so maybe these are bad analogies, but I think you get what I'm trying to say. And the scene that made me make a mental note of this and made it become such a big deal for me to talk about in this particular movie is there's a scene where there's a B-52 bomber that I think comes from America and it's coming to bomb this monster. And then when it drops the bomb, oh my God, the sound effect is so ear grating. And I know, again, I know it's on purpose. I know it's a choice. I know it's trying to be campy, but it just like, it ripped me out of the movie. It was like an out-of-body experience in the worst way possible. Lastly, a big positive I'm gonna say is the use of music. Shin Godzilla was known for using battle music from Evangelion, and this film also borrows some of the Evangelion tracks, as well as using one of my favorite tracks from that film, The Morning in Tokyo. Even though these movies are in different universes, it's kind of neat that they branch them together in ways like this. It kind of creates this umbrella meta universe. Though Hideaki Anno has already said that he's teased the idea of making this crazy shared multidimensional universe, we would love that. So I would say, kind of like the story, the audio and visual presentation in this movie was a bit of a mixed bag for me. Even though I went into this film with almost no expectations, I still left feeling just a little disappointed. The movie had an awesome opening, a lot of great ideas, and some genuinely funny moments. What characterization we got, I thought was pretty good. I just wish we got a little bit more of that. I really don't think you needed that many villains back to back, and I think this would have worked a lot better as like a 10-episode miniseries. I definitely wouldn't have slam dunked nearly as hard on the visual and audio aspects if, you know, the whole package was just a little bit tighter and it presented better overall. And again, if I was exposed to Ultraman in the same way I was with like DC or Marvel or Star Wars, and I already had that, you know, that exposure and knew more about all the elements and characters, it probably wouldn't have bothered me as much, and I probably wouldn't have been as lost. But again, this movie was intended to be a reboot, to bring in new fans and introduce those new fans to this world. I think it was just shy of doing the job it needed to do. Ironically, for as much as I'm talking about it being confusing or jumbled, the story itself I actually don't think was that confusing. It wasn't that complicated. It's just the way in which it was told made it feel far more overbearing than it actually was. There were a lot of scenes added that were clearly fan service, and you can tell it's the otaku love from the creators. You know, nice touches and things that I couldn't appreciate because I wasn't familiar. The film, I think, is just a little bloated. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't need to be there that could have been replaced with just a little bit more character development. There's so many revelations in the final act of the movie that you end up just getting lost, and they're throwing out so much terminology and you're like, I don't know what the fuck that is, and it's just, you know, starts to get exhausting, and at a certain point I kind of just checked out. The main character is like this lifeless doll, and at first it was very charming and funny, but then after a while I'm like, why does he care about these people again? I don't think you get enough moments of Ultraman really learning to like love people and care about them and connect to them. And I'm sure in the comments someone will explain, you know, oh, well, in the Lord, I'm like, yeah, I know, but again, it's about not being able to feel it. If you explain it away in a sentence, to me that's not enough. You need to have more of a visual and emotional, you know, style of storytelling. And again, I think they could have done that if, you know, it was either a 10-episode series or if they just cut out a little bit of the material and saved it for a sequel. And you get this scene where you have the two Ultramen, you know, talking in this interdimensional plane and, you know, talking about humanity and how he's feeling these feelings and etc. And it just feels like this very cheap kind of way to be like, oh, he cares. And it just, you know, these things are happening because the script says so. And I really can't say how much this new movie's added because, again, I'm not intimate with the source material. So I'm going to trust the Ultraman fans. And again, they'll fill out a lot of stuff in the comments, I'm sure, and tell me how I'm wrong. Totally fine. I totally get it. I'm the same way about a lot of things. But again, this is very much a blind review, and I gotta be honest and represent the part of the audience that isn't as familiar with the original franchise. And this is probably an unfair comparison, but I think the reason why Shin Godzilla worked so much better for me and for what seems like a lot of other people than Shin Ultraman was the fact that movie really only has one singular goal. I mean, the plot is really just about, oh my god, something came out of the water, it's destroying everything, we have to stop it. And then each thing in the movie is just leading directly into the next thing. It's just this procedural drama to solve this one problem. And that sounds very dry and boring to some people, but for me, it really made the movie feel like it was a lightning fast pace, even though so much of the movie is just dialogue. The satirical elements really worked. You know, it had something to say. And for some people, it went over their heads, and which totally makes sense. I mean, most people aren't going to be, have social awareness of, the tsunami or Japanese politics or any of that. But, it's one of those things where the movie, it just had a very clear, singular goal. And everything was leading into the next. And like, even though characters obviously didn't have a whole bunch of personality, it was more like, oh God, what do we do? And then just kept going and going and going. And then, you had that big climactic finale. You had a very clear, first act, third act, etc. And with the transformation. So for me, I think the structure of that movie, which is very tight, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the writer, whose name I don't remember, I'll put it on screen now, but the writer who wrote Standalone Complex, The Ghost in the Shell, like the original series, he's the one who wrote the script for that movie. And all his stories have that kind of political element to it, that procedural drama kind of thing. So that's not for everybody, but I think functionally as a movie, it just worked a lot more. Having very clear stakes and understanding the goal from the beginning is really important for making a film feel like it's climbing, or it's going somewhere. It has a point. Shin Ultraman doesn't not have a point, but again, because it has that mystery element, and in your head you're trying to put things together, by the time it reveals everything and has exposition dumps, it just feels really sloppy. So while yes, there was enough to entertain me, and it's such a niche genre, so there were things that appealed to me that made me like it. Overall, with all, like I said, with all the messiness and stuff, it brought it down quite a bit. So if I have to rate it honestly, if 1 is so bad it offends me and 10 is a masterpiece, 5 being average, I'm gonna give it a 5.5. I think that's a fair entry review. It's just enough to make it, for me, worth a watch, or worth recommending to people who I know like these kind of things. I think a lot of people are probably going to be less picky about it than I am. I almost want to give it a 6, but no, I'm going to stick to my guns. I'm going to give it a 5.5. If, I watch more Ultraman shit and I come back to this and I have a different take on it, then maybe that rating would go up a bit. But for now, I'm going to give it a 5.5, which to a lot of people sounds like a death sentence, but trust me, there's much worse shit. Again, if 5 is what you would refer to as mid, this is above mid. Like there's enough interesting things here that kept me entertained, but I really wanted more out of it, and I think that, I'm not going to give it a free pass because I love Hideki Anno. You know what I'm saying? I didn't hate it, and more importantly, it did its job and made me more interested in this series. So if you're a fan of this show, I hope you enjoyed this review, and I hope that you understand my opinion as a blind reviewer going into this movie. I'm very interested in seeing what Anno has to do with Kamen Rider. I'm not sure if he wrote that one. I know he's directing, and I think that his strengths honestly lie more in directing, his visual style, the way he sets up his more unconventional shots. Writing wise, he's a little bit messier, and since he had help and it was a collaborative effort with Evangelion and Shin Godzilla, I think that's a big part of what made those things work. So, we'll see how Shin Kamen Rider comes out, but until next time, thanks for watching.
Hey, did you watch the new Ultraman movie? Yeah, I thought it was ultra mid.